January 1986.
Yeah.
It's the night before the Space Shuttle Challenger is set to launch.
Right, and the engineers are terrified.
Exactly. The engineers who built the solid rocket boosters, they have data from 24 previous launches. And that data shows a really severe problem. The rubber O-rings that seal the booster joints, well, they get damaged in cold weather.
And the forecast for the launch was what, 36 degrees Fahrenheit?
Yeah, 36 degrees.
Yeah.
Which is drastically colder than any previous launch. So they frantically fax a chart to NASA executives to argue for a delay. But NASA looks at the chart, they fail to see the danger, and, they proceed with the launch.
With catastrophic results.
Right. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle breaks apart, tragically killing all 7 crew members. And the thing is, the engineers had the truth. They had the raw numbers. But the way they visually presented that data, it completely masked the life-or-death reality.
It is arguably the most heartbreaking example in modern history of how data visualization is not just about, making things look pretty. The engineers possessed the ground truth, but they failed at the visual translation.
The signal was just totally lost in the noise.
Precisely. And that failure meant the human brains on the receiving end simply could not detect the danger.
Which really brings us to the core of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
If you are preparing for nursing entrance exams like the TEAS or the HESI, you probably already know that interpreting graphics is a heavily tested skill.
Oh, absolutely. You're expected to look at medical charts, flow sheets, vital sign trends.
Right. But this goes far beyond just passing a multiple choice test. Today, we have a huge stack of sources we are pulling from test prep frameworks, the history of cartography, cognitive science, and data visualization theory.
It's a really fascinating mix.
It is. And the mission for you, the listener, today. We want to upgrade how you extract information from visual sources. We are going to help you transform from a passive consumer of charts into a sharp, deeply skeptical data detective. Okay, let's unpack this. Because for a long time, education systems treated reading a chart as if it were just an automatic byproduct of knowing how to read a sentence.
Yeah, that was the prevailing assumption for decades, actually. 50 years ago, a chart in a textbook was basically treated as a decorative accessory. It was just wallpaper.
Like it was just there to break up the text.
Exactly. If you were taught anything, the assumption was that basic literacy and maybe a little bit of math would naturally allow you to decode a graph. But cognitive scientists eventually proved that decoding a graphic is a completely distinct competency.
Which makes total sense when you think about the physical act of reading. I mean, when you read a sentence, the path is totally linear.
Right, left to right.
Yeah, you start on the left, you move to the right, one word at a time. It's like reading text is like walking down a straight, narrow hallway. It's safe, it's predictable.
Yeah.
But reading a graphic is completely non-linear. It's much more like walking into a crowded party.
That is a great way to put it.
Right, because you have to scan the room. You have to figure out who the host is, which, is your title, see who is talking to whom. You look down at the axis, find the legend, and you have to hold all of those complex relationships in your working memory at the exact same time just to understand the vibe of the room.
I think the party analogy captures the cognitive load perfectly. You are synthesizing multiple scattered data points simultaneously. And this distinct challenge is why back in 1965, 2 British geographers, William Balchin and Alan Coleman, argued that we needed a whole new term for this skill.
And that term was graphicacy, right?
Yes, graphicacy. They firmly believed it should be the 4th ace in the pack of fundamental human education, taking its rightful place alongside literacy, numeracy, and articulacy.
And their frustration was that schools prized reading and arithmetic, but they offered zero formal instruction on graphicacy, even though entire fields like medicine and engineering rely entirely on it.
And if we fast forward to today, that lack of training is a massive liability.
Oh, totally. I mean, you open your phone and you are immediately bombarded with interactive dashboards, real-time epidemiological curves, stylized infographics, and they're all engineered by algorithms to go viral.
Which is why the modern application of graphicacy requires an intense layer of skepticism. When you look at a graphic today, your first question cannot just be, what does this say? You have to instinctively ask, how is this chart trying to manipulate my perception?
And to protect ourselves against that manipulation, we really have to understand the biological hardware of how our eyes actually process visuals.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can go back to 1967. A French cartographer named Jacques Bretagne published a foundational test called sémiologie graphique. He mapped out the visual variables that every graphic uses to encode information.
Like what kind of variables?
Things like position, size, shape, color, and texture. And through his research, Burton scientifically proved that human eyes are incredibly precise at judging position and length on a common scale. But biologically, we are terrible at accurately judging angles and two-dimensional area.
Wait, really? So this is why I always hear design instructors and test prep guides screaming at people to avoid 3D pie charts.
Yes.
I used to think that was just design snobbery, like an aesthetic trend.
Yes.
But you are saying it is rooted in measurable human biology.
It goes much deeper than design snobbery, yes. It is a biological limitation. When you look at a standard flat pie chart, you are asking your brain to compare the angles and the 2D areas of the wedges.
Which we are already bad at.
Exactly. We're imprecise at it to begin with. But the moment you tilt that pie chart into a 3D perspective, you drastically distort the area of the wedges in the foreground compared to the background.
Wow. So the ones up front look artificially huge.
Right. You are actively weaponizing human biology against the viewer. You're guaranteeing they will misinterpret the proportions. A bar chart, conversely, relies purely on length and position. Your brain can instantly and flawlessly compare the height of two bars.
Okay, so if our brains have these built-in blind spots, how do you navigate a high-stakes scenario?
Yeah.
Let's say you are sitting for the HESI tomorrow, or you are on the ward staring at a really complex patient flow sheet. Your eyes naturally want to dart straight to the biggest spike or the steepest trend line.
Well, you have to fight that instinct. You need to employ a strict chronological framework. There are 4 first principle questions you must consciously answer before you ever let your eyes follow a trend.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, what is being measured? You have to ground yourself in the axes and the specific units.
Because raw numbers tell a vastly different story than rates or percentages.
Precisely. A chart showing total cases of a disease in a city means nothing without population context. You need to see cases per 100,000 people to know if things are actually getting worse.
Right, that makes sense. So what is the second question?
The second question you must ask is, what is the scale? Does the y-axis actually start at 0? And critically, is it a linear scale or a logarithmic scale?
Oh, let's pause on logarithmic scales because those trip people up constantly on exams.
They really do.
On a linear scale, every grid line goes up by an equal amount, right? 10, 20, 30. But a logarithmic scale goes up by multiples, like 10, 100, 1,000.
Exactly.
So if you are tracking a patient's viral load on a chart and you don't realize the y-axis is logarithmic,
Right.
the visual space between 10 and 100 looks identical to the space between 10,000 and 100,000.
And that is a huge problem. You might look at a slight upward slope and think, oh, the patient is stable, when in reality, the virus is multiplying exponentially.
That is terrifying.
It is a critical clinical application.
Uh-huh.
A misread scale can lead to a catastrophic misunderstanding of patient acuity. Now, once you've verified the scale, your third question is, what does each visual element represent?
Meaning, read the legend.
Simply put, yes. Consult the legend. The patterns and colors are just a meaningless abstract art until you read the key. And finally, the fourth question, what relationship is being shown? Are you looking at a change over time, a correlation between two variables, or a spatial distribution?
Here is where it gets really interesting, though. Understanding how to decode those relationships has literally shaped human history. We mentioned the Challenger disaster earlier, but there are instances where mastering graphicacy has saved countless lives.
It's true, data visualization can be a lifesaver.
Take London in 1854. Our horrific cholera outbreak hits the Soho neighborhood. It killed over 500 people in just 10 days. The prevailing medical consensus at the time was the miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread by foul, bad air.
And the official death registers at the time were just endless tables of text, names, dates, and addresses.
Which doesn't help at all.
Right. Because if you look at a table of 500 addresses, your brain cannot process the spatial relationship between them.
But then, a physician named John Snow took a physical street map of Soho, and for every death, he drew a tiny black bar at the exact street address where the person lived. He turned the geography of the city into the axis of a data visualization.
And the result was immediate.
Yes. Suddenly, by simply mapping it visually, the data screamed off the page. The black bars were heavily clustered around one specific public water pump on Broad Street. Snow used that visual evidence to prove that contaminated water, not bad air, was causing the outbreak. They removed the pump handle, and the deaths plummeted.
Snow proved that a map is not just a picture, it is a profound analytical tool. And just 4 years later, in 1858, Florence Nightingale proved that graphics could be the ultimate tool of persuasion.
Oh, She's a legend for this.
Absolutely. During the Crimean War, Nightingale collected massive amounts of tabular data, proving that British soldiers were dying at 10 times the rate from preventable diseases like typhus and cholera than they were from battle wounds.
But the text in the tables weren't convincing the politicians, right? Parliament was basically ignoring her requests for sanitation funding because staring at columns of numbers just doesn't evoke an emotional response.
Tables of numbers are remarkably easy to ignore. To bypass that apathy, Nightingale invented the polar area diagram, which is often called the coxcomb.
How does that work visually?
Imagine a pie chart, but instead of the wedges having different angles, every wedge has the exact same angle, representing a month of the year. Instead, the wedges extend outward from the center, getting longer based on the number of deaths, and she color-coded them. Red for battle wounds, blue for preventable disease.
The cognitive impact of that must have been staggering. When Parliament looked at this diagram, they didn't just see numbers. They saw this massive, sweeping volume of blue ink threatening to swallow the tiny red slivers of battle deaths.
It was visceral.
Yeah, the sheer physical area of the blue wedges bypassed their analytical brains and hit them right in the emotional center. It literally forced the military to enact sanitation reforms that saved thousands of lives.
Nightingale understood that reading a chart and designing one to persuade are two sides of the same coin. The visual translation is what gives the data its power. Which actually brings us back to the Challenger disaster we discussed at the start, because that shows the dark side of this translation.
Right, where the translation totally fails.
Exactly. We know the engineers faxed a chart to NASA, but we need to understand the mechanism of how that chart failed the human brain.
So they had the data showing O-ring damage at cold temperatures. But when they built the chart, instead of making temperature the x-axis, they sorted all the historical rocket launches chronologically.
Yeah.
By the date they launched.
And to make matters worse, they completely omitted the flights that had zero O-ring damage.
Why does that matter so much?
By removing the zero damage flights, the engineers unintentionally removed the baseline comparison. The human brain's visual processing center requires a baseline to detect a correlation. Because the data was sorted by time rather than temperature, and the successful warm weather flights were missing, the visual correlation between cold weather and failure was completely buried. It just looked like random noise.
This tragic failure in design sparks a massive debate about how charts should actually be built. Because if poor design can accidentally hide the truth, what happens when design is deliberately engineered to manipulate you?
That is the million-dollar question.
In 1983, a statistician named Edward Tuckey published The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. He became the absolute champion of extreme minimalism in charts.
Yes, Tufte introduced the concept of the data-ink ratio. He argued that every drop of ink on a page should represent actual data, and anything else was what he called chart junk.
So if you imagine a standard bar chart, Tufte would say you need to erase the background grid lines, erase the heavy black borders around the bars, erase the 3D shading, and strip away all the bright, distracting colors.
You reduce it until absolutely nothing remains except the pure, unadorned data.
And honestly, this ultra-clean aesthetic is exactly what you are expected to navigate on nursing entrance exams.
What's fascinating here is that Tufte's strict minimalism, while great for clinical precision, might actually be terrible for human memory.
Wait, really? Terribly for memory?
Yes. In 2010, a researcher named Scott Bateman published a study challenging the hatred of chart junk. He took clean, Tufte-approved statistical charts and tested them against highly illustrative, embellished charts.
Embellished how?
Think of a bar chart about the cost of diamond imports, but the bars are drawn as the teeth of a giant cartoon monster.
The expectation would be that the cartoon monster distracts the viewer from the actual numbers.
That was the assumption. But when Bateman tested the participants weeks later, the people who viewed the embellished chart junk graphics remembered the core message and the data relationships significantly better than those who viewed the minimalist charts.
Oh, wow. So the visual embellishments didn't distract from the data at all? They provided a narrative anchor that made the data stick in the brain.
Exactly. A little visual storytelling is very powerful.
But that exact power to anchor a narrative is why we have to be on guard against the dark arts of data manipulation. We see this constantly in the news, where graphics are used to lie while using entirely accurate numbers.
Yes, the manipulation is subtle but very effective.
The May 2020 Georgia Department of Public Health COVID-19 chart is a masterclass in this deception.
It remains a textbook example of manipulation. The department published a bar chart showing COVID-19 cases across the most impacted counties over time. If you glanced at the overall shape, the bars formed a perfectly smooth descending staircase.
The visual narrative clearly communicated that cases were dropping rapidly and the crisis was abating.
But if you stopped and actually read the x-axis, the dates were not in chronological order.
It's so crazy. They had May 5th, followed by April 25th, followed by May 2nd. They literally rearranged the flow of time just to force the tallest bars to the left and the shortest bars to the right.
It is incredibly deceptive.
That is like alphabetizing your monthly bank statements by the name of the month and then congratulating yourself because the bar chart makes it look like your wealth is steadily growing. The numbers on the bars were factual, but the visual sequence was entirely fabricated.
That is a perfect analogy. Another incredibly common manipulation tactic is the truncated y-axis.
Oh, I see this in politics all the time.
Exactly. If a political campaign wants to make a tiny 2-point difference in polling look like a massive insurmountable lead, they don't lie about the polling numbers. They just start the axis at 40% instead of 0.
And suddenly, a 2-point difference looks like a towering visual canyon. You are trusting the visual shape instead of running the axis.
Right. You have to check the baseline.
These traps are everywhere, which is why I want to pivot to the anxieties people actually face when sitting for these exams or working on the floor. I hear a lot of sweeping rules about what charts are good and bad, and it gets really confusing.
There are a lot of myths out there.
Like, for instance, the absolute hatred of pie charts. I feel like I'm conditioned to think they're fundamentally broken and I shouldn't ever trust them on an exam.
Pie charts are not fundamentally broken. They are just heavily abused. They are perfectly valid, but only if you use them for a very small number of categories, ideally 2 to 5.
And they have to equal 100%, right?
Yes, only when those categories represent parts of a meaningful whole. They fail when a designer crams 20 tiny slices into them, or, as we discussed earlier, tilts them into 3D.
Okay, what about the trap of correlation and causation? If I'm looking at a scatter plot and I see 2 distinct lines rising together in perfect harmony, my brain immediately assumes that one thing is causing the other.
That is a cognitive bias you must actively suppress. A graphic can only ever prove that 2 variables move together. It possesses no mechanism to tell you why.
Right.
The canonical example in statistics is that ice cream sales and drowning deaths both spike in exact correlation on a timeline.
But buying an ice cream cone doesn't magically cause you to drown in a pool. There is a hidden third variable.
Summer weather.
Exactly. The arrival of hot summer weather independently causes people to buy ice cream and causes more people to go swimming, which unfortunately leads to more drownings.
The shared trend line proves correlation, but without knowing the underlying mechanism, inferring causation from a chart is dangerous.
Another thing that trips people up is choosing between a bar graph and a line graph. Sometimes, especially news articles, they seem totally interchangeable. Like the graphic designer just wanted to mix things up for aesthetic variety.
In rigorous environments, though, they serve mutually exclusive functions. A line graph is reserved for continuous data, typically tracking something over uninterrupted time.
So the line visually implies a constant flow from one data point to the next.
Yes. A bar graph, however, is designed for discrete, separate categories. If you plot discrete categories, like different hospital wards, and connect them with a continuous line, you are visually implying a relationship or flow between them that does not exist in reality.
And what about maps? We talked about Jon Snow, but sometimes a map on an exam feels like a trick question, like it's just a geographical illustration rather than hard data.
Never dismiss a map as just an illustration. A map is a high-density data visualization where the spatial geography itself serves as the axis. You must subject a map to the exact same rigorous scrutiny as a complex scatter plot.
So check the legend, check the scale.
Check the legend for color gradients, verify the scale bar for distance, and always confirm the orientation.
This all really boils down to why this skill is so vital.
Sure.
If you are stepping into a nursing career, this is not just an academic hurdle to clear for the TEAS exam. When you are on the floor, under immense fatigue and extreme time pressure, you are going to be reading medication titration graphs and vital sign trend lines.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Right. A misread slope on a patient's chart doesn't just mean a lost point on a test. It can mean missing a subtle physical deterioration. And even outside the hospital, graphicacy is basic civic survival. It dictates how we interpret inflation charts, polling data, and the reported efficacy of new medications.
It really is the lens through which modern truths communicated.
So, pulling our mission together. Whenever you are confronted with a graphic, force yourself to slow down. Interrogate the axes before your eyes are allowed to trace the trend line. Remember that the legend is the dictionary for the visual language you're reading. It is never optional. And fundamentally, burn it into your brain that completely accurate numbers can be weaponized through design to tell a deeply false story.
So what does this all mean?
This raises an important question, and it is the thought I want you to carry forward. We have analyzed how charts are designed to persuade us, and we know that modern dashboards let us interact with data. But we are rapidly moving into a digital era where algorithms monitor our behavior and customize our environments in real time.
What happens when data visualizations become hyper-personalized?
Wait, you mean like an algorithm dynamically rewriting a chart specifically for my screen?
Yes. Imagine a news dashboard that automatically truncates its axes, shifts its color psychology, and reorganizes its layout based entirely on what the algorithm knows about your personal political biases and emotional triggers.
Wow.
If the very structure of the data visualization shifts to tell you exactly what you want to hear, how will you ever know if you are looking at the objective truth? Or are you just staring into a custom-built algorithmic echo chamber, perfectly disguised as a bar chart?
That is a genuinely terrifying but deeply fascinating thought to end on. But remember, you now have the tools to break out of that echo chamber. Be a skeptic. Ground yourself in the axis. Look at the world and your exam prep with much sharper eyes. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.